my house immediately. There's no one left to protect you two useless people anymore.
The iron gate of the Adeyemi mansion creaked open with a cold, dry screech. "Out! Both of you get out of my house right now." The woman's voice cut through the courtyard like a blade, echoing in the air that still carried the faint smell of incense from the funeral that had just ended. At the gate, the elderly couple stumbled forward. An old suitcase fell onto the stone floor and burst open. A few worn pieces of clothing spilled out onto the ground, scattering across the yard like fragments of memories that had been thrown away. The old mother bent down to gather them, her hands trembling. Just a few hours ago, they had been sitting in front of their son's portrait. Just a few hours ago, this house still called them mother and father. And now, they stood outside the gate like strangers. On the front steps, Afunanya, the widow of Colonel Adeyemi, stood with her arms folded. There were no tears left on her face, only a coldness so deep that even the relatives still standing in the yard fell silent. "This house," she said slowly, "has been in my name for a long time, and I will not feed two useless old people." Her words fell into the quiet courtyard like heavy stones. Baba Adeyemi stood still, his back bent a little more. Mama Adeyemi only held her mourning scarf against her chest, her eyes empty, as if her heart had just been broken for the second time. No one in the crowd dared to step forward. No one dared to say a word, because sometimes human cruelty can frighten people even more than death itself. But what Afunanya did not know was that Colonel, the husband who had been buried that very morning, had left one final thing behind, a recording, a final message, and when it would be played, this entire house would never be the same again. Today's story takes place in Lagos, Nigeria, a place where family, honor, and respect for parents have always been deeply valued. But sometimes, inside the grandest houses, the coldest hearts are the ones hiding within. This is not just a story about a daughter-in-law. It is a story about truth, gratitude, and the price of cruelty. If you enjoy deep and meaningful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And now, stay with us and listen until the very end, because sometimes one small truth can make an entire house fall silent forever. Few people knew that a few weeks before his death, Colonel Adeyemi had done something that even those closest to him could not understand. It was a late evening in a private hospital in Lagos. Outside the window, the city was still glowing with lights. But inside the quiet room on the upper floor, the soft glow of a wall lamp made everything feel strangely still. Colonel lay on the hospital bed. 4 tubes ran along his arm, which had grown noticeably thinner. Pain had tormented him for months, but that night, after the medication began to take effect, he seemed more lucid. He turned his head toward the man standing near the door, his personal lawyer. "Mr. Musa, I need you to witness something." Lawyer Musa stepped closer to the bed. He had worked with Colonel for many years. He had seen him sign contracts worth millions of dollars with complete confidence. But now, the man who had once been so powerful looked so fragile that Musa had to swallow the tightness forming in his throat. A nurse entered the room, just as Colonel had requested earlier. Colonel gave a slight nod. "Please place the phone in front of me." The phone was set on the small table beside the bed. The screen lit up, reflecting his pale face. Colonel lifted his hand, trembling slightly, and pressed the record button. The room immediately fell silent. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor could be heard. Colonel looked directly at the phone, as if he were speaking to someone far away. His voice was weak, but every word was clear. "If one day my parents hear this recording, it means that I am no longer alive." He paused. His breathing grew heavier. The nurse glanced quietly at Lawyer Musa, but Colonel signaled that he was still fine. He continued, "My whole life I tried to build everything from nothing. I made money, built a home, created a reputation. But there is one thing I have never forgotten. His eyes slowly turned toward the window, where the lights of Lagos shimmered in the night. My parents. A faint smile appeared on his lips. They sacrificed their entire lives so that I could become who I am today. He took a deep breath before speaking again. But there is something that has always worried me. Lawyer Musa frowned slightly. He had never heard Kunal speak with a voice like this before. Kunal closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if gathering the last of his strength. Then he opened them again. I am afraid that, when I die, my parents will have no one left to protect them. The room suddenly felt heavier. No one spoke. Kunal stared at the phone as if he already knew that one day these words would be heard again. If my wife ever treats them badly. He paused and coughed softly. The nurse stepped forward, wanting to adjust the IV line, but Kunal gently shook his head. He had to finish. Then play this recording in front of the entire family. Lawyer Musa stood frozen. In that moment, he understood that Kunal was not simply leaving a message. He was preparing for a truth he feared might one day happen. Kunal looked at the phone screen one more time. His voice became slower and deeper. I do not want my parents to beg for mercy in the very house that I built for them. A long silence followed. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Kunal closed his eyes as if he had already said the most important thing. After a few seconds, he opened them again and spoke his final sentence. If that day truly comes, then let the whole family know the truth. He reached out and stopped the recording. The room returned to the familiar sounds of the hospital. Lawyer Musa picked up the phone. He looked at the screen, where the audio file had just been saved. He did not know whether that recording would ever need to be used. But the look in Kunal's eyes a moment earlier made him understand one thing. The man lying on that hospital bed had sensed something. Something that even he himself could not fully imagine. A few weeks later, Kunal Ademi passed away. And this very morning, after the funeral had ended, the elderly couple had been thrown out of their own son's house. No one standing in the courtyard of the Ademi mansion knew that. Somewhere, locked carefully inside a safe belonging to Lawyer Musa, there still existed a recording. A recording Kunal had made on that quiet hospital night. A recording that, if it were ever played, would make the entire house fall silent. That afternoon, after the last cars drove away from the gate of the Ademi mansion, the place became so quiet that the sound of the wind moving through the palm trees in the front yard could be heard clearly. The funeral was over. White wreaths still leaned against the walls. A few plastic chairs that had not yet been cleared away were scattered across the courtyard. The faint scent of incense still lingered in the air, like the final trace of the son who had just been laid to rest. Inside the large living room, Mama Adezimi was quietly cleaning up. She lifted the remaining teacups from the table one by one and placed them onto a wooden tray with slow, careful movements. Her hands trembled slightly, not only because of her age, but also because of the pain that had not yet settled. Every corner of the house reminded her of Kunal, the chair where he used to sit and work, the piano in the corner that he once bought for his mother, the family photo hanging on the wall, where Kunal stood in the middle, one arm around his father's shoulder, the other holding his mother close, smiling proudly. Mama Adeyemi paused when she looked at that photograph. Her eyes grew blurry. But she did not cry. Some pain runs so deep that even tears become meaningless. Outside in the yard, Baba Adeyemi was stacking the chairs from the funeral. He moved slowly, his back more bent than before. Every step seemed heavier, as if both old age and grief were pressing down on his shoulders at the same time. He stopped for a moment and looked around the yard. This was the place where Kunal used to run and play as a child. The place where he had taught his son how to kick a football. The place where they had held family celebrations when Kunal first began to succeed in business. Now, only silence remained. Suddenly the front door burst open. The sound of the door slamming against the wall echoed through the empty house, causing both Mama and Baba Adeyemi to turn their heads at the same time. Ifunanya stepped out from inside the house. She was still wearing her black mourning dress, but the sorrow she had shown that morning seemed to have completely disappeared. Her eyes were cold. She walked down a few steps and stood in the living room as if she were facing strangers. Her voice rang out, short and firm. "You two need to speak with me." Baba Ademi set the chair down. He slowly walked inside. Mama Ademi placed the tray of cups on the table and turned around. The elderly couple now stood facing their daughter-in-law. Baba Ademi spoke first, his voice gentle as always. "What is it, my child?" He still called her my child, even though just a few hours earlier they had buried their only son. Ifunanya folded her arms across her chest. There was no trace of respect left in her eyes. "From today, this house belongs to me." The words fell into the room like a heavy stone. Mama Adeyemi froze. She blinked several times, as if she believed she had heard wrong. "What did you say?" Ifunanya shrugged. "I said it very clearly." She turned her head and looked around the spacious living room, where the crystal chandeliers were still glowing. "This house has been in my name since last year." Baba Adeyemi frowned. Kunal had never mentioned anything like that. "Kunal never." Ifunanya cut him off. "He didn't need to tell you." Her voice was calm in a way that felt almost frightening. Mama Adeyemi stepped forward. "But this is Kunal's house, and we are family." Ifunanya let out a quiet laugh. It was a smile without a single hint of warmth. "No, Mama," she said slowly. "This is my house." Then she raised her hand and pointed straight toward the gate. "You two should leave." The air in the room instantly froze. Baba Adeyemi looked at his daughter-in-law. He tried to find some sign that this was simply grief speaking. But Ifunanya's eyes were completely clear, completely cold. "You're joking, aren't you?" he asked softly. Ifunanya shook her head. "I don't have time for this." She walked over to the table and picked up a stack of papers. "These are the ownership documents." She placed them on the table in front of them. "I think you should read them." Mama Adeyemi did not look at the papers. She only looked at Ifunanya, her eyes filled with confusion. "You just lost your husband," she said quietly. "How can you say such things to his parents?" A flash of irritation crossed Ifunanya's face. "Because I don't want to continue living with the two of you." The answer was short, cruel. Baba Ademi sighed softly. In that moment, he seemed to grow several years older. He looked around the house. Everything in this home was connected to his son. But now he was beginning to understand something. The house might still be standing, but the home they once called family was gone. Outside, the wind moved through the funeral wreaths. A single white petal fell onto the stone floor. And inside the grand living room of the Adeyemi mansion, everything was beginning to change. Mama Adeyemi trembled so much that the mourning scarf in her hands shook with every broken breath. Her aged face had turned pale, and her reddened eyes were still filled with the grief that had not yet settled after the funeral that morning. She looked at Ifunanya as if hoping she had heard wrong, as if one more second might make the young widow soften, might remind her that the man who had just been buried was not only her husband, but also the only son of the two people standing before her now. Her voice was hoarse. "My son was just buried. How can you?" But before she could finish, Ifunanya cut her off. Not with explosive anger, but with a voice so cold it was more frightening than a shout. "I took care of him through his illness. I stayed by his bedside. I endured everything. This house is mine. I have no obligation to support the two of you." Each word fell into the room like a hammer, striking what little dignity remained. Mama Adeyemi stood frozen. Beside her, Baba Ademi's rough hand tightened around the handle of his cane until his knuckles turned white. He did not speak immediately. Not because he had nothing to say, but because some moments are so painful that language itself becomes powerless. He looked at the daughter-in-law who once bowed to greet him every morning, who once shared meals with the family during holidays, who had been given the finest fabrics by his wife on her wedding day. And now that same woman stood in his son's house with the indifferent expression of someone discarding an old object that no longer has value. Outside in the yard, the plastic chairs from the funeral were still scattered everywhere. A few disposable cups lay forgotten near the wall. The smell of incense lingered in the wind. The atmosphere of mourning had not yet faded, and yet another separation had already begun, crueler, colder, and beyond the comfort of any prayer. Mama Adeyemi stepped forward, her hands clasped together in front of her chest like a plea. "Ifunanya, please, don't do this. This is our son's home. This is the place where he brought his parents to live out their old age." Her voice broke on the final word. A tear fell onto the back of her wrinkled hand. But Ifunanya did not look at that tear. She turned and walked quickly toward the hallway corner where the elderly couple's old suitcase rested against the wall. It was the suitcase they had brought from their small village to Lagos, carrying a few sets of clothes, some medicine, a few old family photographs, and the wool scarf Mama Adeyemi always wore at night. It was a cheap suitcase, frayed at the edges, worth almost nothing, but inside it was everything that remained of two people who had spent their entire lives raising a child. Ifunanya bent down and grabbed the handle. Then she pulled it hard. The wheels scraped loudly against the stone floor, echoing sharply through the quiet house like the sound of something being torn apart beyond repair. Mama Adeyemi gasped, "Don't," but it was too late. Ifunanya dragged the suitcase to the front door and without hesitation, yanked the door open and threw the suitcase out into the yard. The suitcase slammed onto the stone pavement with a heavy thud. The lock snapped open. The lid burst apart. Old clothes, a few packets of medicine, a worn pair of slippers, several family photographs, and a small Bible scattered across the cement ground. One photograph flipped over into a puddle of water left from when the yard had been washed earlier. Mama Adeyemi let out a choking sob. It was a small sound, but it carried so much pain that the entire courtyard seemed to freeze. She staggered outside and collapsed to her knees beside the scattered belongings. Her old hands trembled as she picked up each item, brushing away dust as if trying to rescue the last fragments of dignity she still possessed. She lifted the small Bible first, pressing it to her chest, before reaching for the family photograph now damp with water. When she turned the photograph over, the image of a young Colonel appeared standing proudly between his parents, smiling brightly on the first day he had brought them to live with him in Lagos. Tears streamed down Mama Adeyemi's face. "Ifunanya." She choked, almost unable to breathe. "Please, this is my son's house." But Ifunanya did not stop, not a trace of softness, not a moment of hesitation. She walked straight to the large iron gate at the front of the compound, grabbed the lock bar, and pulled it open. The two heavy gates swung wide with a long, cold screech, as if even the mansion itself protested what was about to happen, but was powerless to stop it. Wind from the street rushed in, scattering a few remaining white petals from the funeral wreaths. Ifunanya stood beside the gate and pointed outside. "Go." 2 short words. No anger. No shouting. It was the calmness in her voice that made it truly chilling. Baba Adeyemi stepped onto the porch. He looked at the clothes lying on the ground, at his elderly wife kneeling there, picking them up like a beggar, and then he looked at the open gate leading to the road outside. There was no anger left in his eyes now, only a pain so deep, so quiet, and so heavy it seemed as if his entire life had just been denied in a few short minutes. There was a time when he had been a strong man. There was a time when those hands built houses, plowed fields, and raised a child. There was a time when people in the village came to him for advice. But now, what stood before him was not poverty, not illness, not old age. It was humiliation. A kind of pain that only comes when gratitude dies in someone else's heart. He bent down and helped his wife to her feet. "Let's stand up," he said softly. Mama Adeyemi looked up at him, her face soaked with tears. She said nothing, only nodded weakly. Baba Adeyemi took the broken suitcase and gathered the scattered belongings back inside, even though he knew that some things once fallen to the ground, could never return to the way they were before. Out on the street, several neighbors had stopped. A fruit seller stood frozen beside her cart. Two small children hid behind their mother's legs, staring with wide eyes. A middle-aged man passing by removed his hat, watching the scene with shock. No one spoke. No one dared to intervene. Because there are moments when cruelty unfolds right before your eyes, yet leaves you frozen, as if what you are witnessing is so wrong that you do not even know where to begin stopping it. Baba Ademi took his wife's hand. His hand was rough and thin, but he held hers tightly as if it were the only thing he could still protect. Slowly, the two of them walked toward the gate. Each step dragged behind it a lifetime of sacrifice. They passed the place where Kunal used to stand to see guests off, past the tree where he once drank morning tea with his father, past the steps where Mama used to wait for her son to return home from work. Everything was still there. Only humanity had disappeared. When they reached the gate, Mama Adeyemi turned back one last time. Her eyes rested on the mansion. It was no longer the gaze of a mother looking at the house her son had built. It was the look of someone who had just been pushed out of her own memories. And then, bang! The iron gate slammed shut behind them. The metallic sound echoed against the walls, across the courtyard, and into the chests of those watching like a final blade cutting everything apart. Mama Adeyemi flinched slightly. Baba Adeyemi did not turn around. He stood still for 1 second, still holding his wife's hand, and then slowly continued walking. On the other side of the gate, Ifunanya had already disappeared back inside the house. As if the elderly couple had never existed. As if loyalty, sacrifice, and the years spent raising Kunal had been nothing more than a chapter that could be erased with the slam of a gate. The road in front of the mansion was silent. The wind blew past, carrying the scent of funeral flowers and street dust. A dog barked once at the end of the street and then fell quiet again. The neighbors watched the two elderly figures slowly walk away beside their worn old suitcase. In that moment, everyone understood that what they had just witnessed was not only shameful but terrifying. Because the most frightening thing in the world is not poverty, not death, but the moment when a person can throw their husband as parents into the street right after his funeral, and still keep a face as cold as stone. And right there, on that silent street in Lagos, beneath a gray sky that seemed to press down upon the earth, everyone understood. This was the coolest moment they had ever seen. 3 days after the funeral, the Ademi mansion once again opened its doors to relatives. But this time, there were no sobs of mourning, no embraces of sympathy, no thick scent of funeral incense hanging in the air like before. In its place was a different atmosphere, closed, heavy, cautious, as if even the walls of the house knew that something was going to happen that afternoon. The family gathering had been called to read Kunal's will. The large living room was full. Aunts, uncles, distant relatives, and a few close family friends all sat in small clusters. Chairs had been arranged in straight rows facing the long table at the center of the room, where Lawyer Musa was organizing his documents. The crystal chandelier above still glowed as usual, but its light did nothing to warm the room today. It only made every face more visible, more curious, more tense, and in some eyes, full of calculating anticipation. Ifunanya sat in the center seat. She had chosen the best place in the room, near the tea table, near the lawyer, near the center of everyone's attention. The black morning dress she had worn before had been replaced with an elegant cream-colored dress, modest but expensive. Her face was lightly made up, just enough to conceal her fatigue and preserve the appearance of a woman in control of the situation. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded together on her lap. Her expression was confident. And if anyone looked closely, they could even see a trace of cold reassurance at the corner of her mouth, the quiet confidence of someone who believed. Victory was already securely in her hands. In one corner of the room, near an old wooden cabinet, Mama Adeyemi and Baba Ademi were escorted in by a relative. 3 days earlier, they had been thrown out of this house like strangers. 3 days later, They had returned, not as the parents of the deceased, but almost like silent shadows who had merely been allowed to sit at the edge of the story. Mama Adeyemi wore her old black outfit, her headscarf neatly wrapped, both hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she feared they would start trembling if she let go. Baba Adeyemi sat beside her, his back bent, his wooden cane planted between his knees. His face was so still, it was hard to guess what he was thinking, but the dark circles beneath his eyes and the tight line of his mouth made one thing very clear. Over the past 3 days he had barely slept. No one in the room looked at them for long. Some pain makes other people feel guilty just for meeting it with their eyes. Lawyer Musa stood at the head of the table. He wore a dark gray suit, a black tie, and neatly adjusted glasses. His face held its usual professional calm, but there was something heavier in his eyes than people were used to seeing. On the table before him was a thick file, several sealed envelopes, and one small black object set apart on the right. A voice recorder. That ordinary little device rested quietly on the polished wood surface, yet somehow it made the air in the room feel tighter. A few relatives tilted their heads toward it and whispered softly. Afunanya glanced at it once as well, but quickly looked away, as if it were nothing worth noticing. When the wall clock struck exactly 3 in the afternoon, Lawyer Musa cleared his throat. All the whispers immediately died down. He slowly straightened his posture, placed both hands on the edge of the table, and looked across the room as if making sure no one would miss what was about to be said. "Thank you all for being here." His voice was low, clear, and controlled, just loud enough for every corner of the room to hear. By legal requirement, today we are gathered to announce the final instructions contained in the will of the late Mr. Colonel Adeyemi. The words "the late Mr. Colonel Adeyemi" made the room fall even quieter. Some lowered their heads, some sighed. Mama Adeyemi closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if hearing her son's name alone was enough to send pain through her chest again. Lawyer Musa opened the file before him and turned a few pages. Then he stopped. His eyes were no longer on the paper. He looked directly at everyone in the room. "However," he said slowly, "before I read the will, Mr. Colonel left a special instruction." A ripple moved through the room. Ifunanya frowned slightly. One of Colonel's aunts leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something. An older uncle slowly removed his glasses and held them in his hand, as if he sensed that what came next would not be a simple legal formality. Lawyer Musa placed his hand on the voice recorder. He requested that, before any property is mentioned, everyone must listen to this. The air in the room seemed to stop. Ifunanya lifted her head. For the first time since the gathering began, the confidence on her face showed a tiny fracture, thin, almost invisible, but enough for a sharp observer to notice. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice was still calm, but slightly faster than usual. Lawyer Musa did not answer immediately. He only looked at her for one brief second, then pressed play. Click, a faint crackling sound came from the small speaker. And then, Colonel's voice filled the room. Weak, slow, but so clear that it felt as if the man himself were standing just behind the door, about to walk into the room. "If you are hearing this." The entire room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the voice of a dead man, and nothing silences human beings faster than hearing the voice of someone who has just been buried return to his old house. "It means that I am dead." Mama Adeyemi raised a hand to her mouth. Her eyes immediately reddened. Baba Adeyemi lowered his head, his hand tightening around the top of his cane. In the corner of the room, a few relatives exchanged glances. An older woman began wiping tears from her eyes. A man who had been leaning back in his chair suddenly sat up straight, as if that voice had pulled them all out of the present and back into the days when Colonel was still alive. The recording continued. "If I am no longer here, I have only one request." Colonel's voice weakened at the end of the sentence, as if he had needed to stop and gather breath. The room was so silent that the hum of the air conditioner and the ticking of the wall clock could both be heard. Protect my parents. Those words came slowly, not like a wish, but like a final plea drawn from the last strength a human being had left. Mama Adeyemi broke into tears, not loudly. Just a choked sound escaping from her chest, but enough to make several women sitting nearby grow red-eyed. Baba Adeyemi tilted his head toward the floor. His face remained rigid, but at the corner of his jaw, a muscle twitched slightly, as if he were struggling to keep something immense from breaking through. Afunanya remained seated, but her fingers had tightened around each other. Lawyer Musa did not look at her. He simply let the recording continue to play. Then the next sentence came, slower, heavier, and when it rang out, it felt as though the air had been drained from the room. If my wife throws them out of the house. No one breathed too hard. No one moved. A glass on the table caught the chandelier's reflection and trembled slightly because someone had accidentally touched it, but even that person did not dare lift it. Let the whole family know the truth. The atmosphere froze solid. This was no longer metaphor. In that instant, the entire room seemed trapped inside an invisible sheet of ice. The relatives who had been sitting scattered and cautious suddenly turned their heads all at once. Every eye one by one moved toward the same person. Ifunanya. She was still sitting in the center seat. But now that place no longer looked like the throne of a winner. It looked like a chair set in the middle of an invisible courtroom. Her face had gone pale, not the pale color of grief, but the color of someone who had just realized that something she thought had been buried with the past was rising again in front of everyone. The corner of her mouth twitched slightly, as if she were about to say something, but no sound came out. One ant on the left blinked repeatedly, then slowly turned her entire body to stare at Afunanya in disbelief. A younger uncle furrowed his brow deeply. A woman who had been sitting beside Afunanya earlier now quietly shifted her chair half an inch farther away, a tiny gesture, yet one that carried the full force of a crowd changing direction. In that room, within just a few short seconds, Ifunanya's position had changed completely. No one asked why Kunal would say such a thing, because the question already contained its own answer. The dead do not leave warnings for the living without reason. Mama Adeyemi looked up. Tears ran down her wrinkled face, but this time there was not only pain in her eyes. Something else was there too fragile, faint, but unmistakable. It was the feeling of being seen, of being believed, of being protected by her son, even from beyond death itself. Lawyer Musa did not stop the recorder right away. He allowed the silence after Kunal's words to spread through the room, as if he wanted everyone to truly feel the weight of them. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. And within that thick, heavy stillness, something happened that no one needed to declare aloud. Everything in that room had shifted. No one looked at the will anymore as a few pages about property. No one looked at the gathering anymore as a family formality. Now, everyone was waiting for only one thing: the truth. And Ifunanya, sitting in the middle of the room with her pale face, finally understood that what was coming for her was no longer whispered gossip or judgmental looks from relatives. What was coming was the moment when a room full of people suddenly realized that the dead man had seen, long before anyone else, what no one had ever expected. And that voice from beyond the grave had brought the entire room to a halt. No one in the living room moved immediately after the recording ended. The voice recorder still sat on the polished wooden table, small and silent, yet it seemed as though the entire weight of the room had settled upon it. Kunal's voice had faded, but the echo of every word still hung in the air, between the stunned faces, beneath the cold chandelier light, within the walls that had witnessed too much and could no longer keep it hidden. Ifunanya was still standing there. Her back was straight, her hands at her sides, but the confidence she had carried earlier was completely gone. Her face had turned as pale as if all the blood had drained from it. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes no longer held the cold composure of someone who believed she controlled everything. She looked at the lawyer, then at the relatives, then quickly toward the elderly couple seated in the corner. For the first time since entering the gathering, she looked like someone backed against an invisible wall she had never expected to face. Lawyer Musa slowly reached out and switched off the recorder. The click was very soft. But in that suffocating silence, it sounded like a final period at the end of a sentence. He did not speak right away. He opened the file before him and pulled out a thick document neatly clipped inside a cream-colored folder. Every movement he made was slow, precise, and calm, so calm that it only made the tension in the room feel heavier. No one whispered anymore. No one shifted in their seats. Even the quiet cough of a man in the back row seemed to vanish into the silence tightening around everyone. Then Lawyer Musa spoke. "In the will of Mr. Colonel Ademi." He paused briefly, eyes lowered to the document in front of him, as if making sure not a single word would be spoken incorrectly. "This house is legally owned by his parents." A wave of murmurs erupted instantly. No longer restrained breaths or doubtful glances, but a true shock spreading from the front row to the back of the room like a wave crashing across a frozen lake. One aunt clutched her chest. An older uncle jerked his head up. Several relatives stared at one another in stunned disbelief, as if unsure they had heard correctly. In the corner of the room, Mama Ademi froze completely. She did not blink. She did not move, as if her body had not yet caught up with what her ears had just heard. Beside her, Baba Ademi also sat motionless for several seconds. He looked at the lawyer, then down at his thin hands resting on the wooden cane, as though he needed a moment to be certain he was not dreaming in a room full of witnesses. But the strongest reaction came from Ifunanya. She shot to her feet. The chair behind her scraped sharply across the marble floor. "That's impossible!" Her voice rang out, no longer under control. This was no longer the cold, commanding voice that had ordered them out at the gate 3 days earlier. It was the voice of someone who had just felt the ground split open beneath her feet. Lawyer Musa slowly lifted his eyes to her. He was not shaken in the slightest by the outburst. This document was legally signed, fully notarized, and properly filed before Mr. Colonel passed away. Ifunanya shook her head and took half a step forward, as if she wanted to snatch the papers from his hands. "He couldn't have done that without telling me." The moment the words left her mouth, several people in the room exchanged glances, because that sentence had betrayed her. It was not the cry of a grieving widow devastated by her husband's death. It was the protest of someone furious that a right she thought belonged to her had, in truth, never been hers at all. Lawyer Musa gently closed the folder and opened to another page. His voice remained steady and firm. In addition, Mr. Colonel also wrote that. The room fell silent once again. Everyone followed his next words, as if the fate of the entire afternoon rested inside them. If his parents were mistreated, the recording was to be played before the entire family. No one breathed too loudly. No one interrupted. That sentence, spoken in the lawyer's dry, formal tone, carried an even heavier force. It confirmed that what they had just heard was not merely the vague fear of a dying man. Colonel had anticipated this. He had thought ahead. He had prepared everything with the last clarity he possessed. One aunt from his father's side slowly turned to look at Ifunanya and then shook her head. An older uncle closed his eyes and let out a heavy breath, as though the truth before him was even more painful than he had imagined, and Mama Ademi began to cry. But this time, it was not the broken sobbing of a woman ripped from her son's home. Not the cry of humiliation, of old age, thrown into the street like something unwanted. This was a different kind of cry. It still trembled. It was still weak. But inside it was something that had begun to loosen after days of being held tightly shut. It was the cry of a mother who had just learned that her son, even after crossing the final boundary of life, had not forgotten to turn back and shield her. She raised a hand to cover her mouth, her thin shoulders trembling. Tears rolled through the deep lines time had etched into her face. But for the first time since the funeral, her eyes were no longer empty. There was pain in them. There was loss. But there was something else to a comfort that had come late, gentle and fierce at the same time. Baba Adeyemi turned to look at his wife. He said nothing. He simply reached out his rough, weathered hand. Mama Adeyemi placed her hand into his. Baba Adeyemi held it tightly. It was only a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like two people who had just walked through the darkest night had finally seen the faintest line of light on the horizon. In that room, everyone understood something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Kunal had known. Perhaps he had not known exactly how events would unfold. Perhaps he had never imagined that things would become so cruel that his parents would be thrown out only hours after his funeral. But somewhere in those months on the hospital bed, as he watched his world slowly slipping away, he had sensed something others could not see. He had understood how fragile his aging parents were. He had felt the coldness hiding beneath the silent exterior of the woman he had once called his wife. And so he had left behind an invisible arm, a will, a recording, a truth. Even after he was gone, he was still protecting his parents. And Ifunanya still stood there, in the middle of a room full of her husband's relatives. But now she was no longer the center of attention people treated with caution or respect. She stood among them like a shadow stripped of every layer that had once protected her. No one stepped forward to comfort her. No one said, "Calm down." No one spoke in her defense. The people who had been sitting beside her earlier now quietly turned away. The eyes fixed on her were no longer curious. They were filled with a heavy disappointment, cold and sharp as glass. She opened her mouth as if to explain something, then closed it again. Because in moments like these, excuses become small, useless, and painfully late. The truth had already been spoken before the whole family. There was no need to argue anymore. No need to justify anything. No need for a courtroom. Because sometimes the harshest judgment does not come through shouting, through tears, or through an open accusation. It comes through silence, a shared silence. A silence in which everyone understands that someone has crossed the final limit of what the human heart should ever become. And that silence suddenly grew heavier than any spoken condemnation. Lawyer Musa set the will down on the table. Outside the window, the afternoon light of Lagos was fading across the palm trees. The sun slanted through the glass, stretching the figures in the living room into long, quiet shadows across the stone floor. The house was still the same house. The walls still stood. The chandelier still shone. The chairs were still lined up in rows. But everyone could feel with absolute certainty that after that afternoon, nothing in that house would ever be the same again. Mama Adeyemi slowly lifted her eyes to Kunal's photograph hanging on the wall. In the frame, he was still smiling. The smile of a son who had risen from hardship, who had loved his parents with a quiet devotion so deep that others only fully understood it after he was gone. She looked at that picture for a long time, then whispered softly, almost too quietly for anyone but herself to hear, "You are still here." People still hurried through the hot, dusty streets of Lagos, but inside the living room of the Adeyemi mansion, time seemed to pause for one more beat long enough for everyone to realize that justice does not always arrive with thunder, does not always come with an explosion of anger. Sometimes it comes very late, very quietly, and then stands in the middle of the room, forcing everyone to look directly at it. And that is why, that afternoon, no one said another word to Ifunanya, because sometimes the silence of an entire family is heavier than any accusation. And sometimes a son, even after he has been laid to rest, can still be the last one standing to protect his parents.